The relationship between the United States and India has always been portrayed as one of shared democratic ideals and mutual strategic interests. But beneath the surface of this narrative lies a complex reality. In recent decades, the partnership between the two countries was often celebrated as a cornerstone of stability in the Indo-Pacific region, an engine for global economic growth, and a natural alliance of the world's largest democracy with the world's most powerful one. Yet despite the lofty words of leaders, joint statements, and summits, cracks began to appear, slowly at first and then more visibly, revealing that what was often described as an unshakable bond was in fact a relationship still finding its foundation. This is where the story of shared roots but emerging cracks begins, a tale of how common values and goals brought two nations close, but mismatched expectations and diverging worldviews prevented that closeness from maturing into complete trust. At the heart of the US-India relationship has always been the recognition that both countries see themselves as leaders in their own right. For the United States, its identity as the global defender of democracy and champion of liberal values shapes its foreign policy approach. For India, its proud history as an ancient civilization and its long struggle for independence gave rise to a foreign policy rooted in autonomy, self-respect, and resistance to external domination. When these two self-identities converged, they produced powerful moments of unity, but when they clashed, they created fissures that were difficult to repair. The shared roots of democracy and mutual admiration for each other's accomplishments became the glue that held the partnership together, but when ambitions conflicted, those same roots could not prevent the cracks from widening. The post-Cold War era marked a turning point when India and the US began moving closer after decades of estrangement. The US saw India's economic reforms of the 1990s as an opportunity to invest in one of the largest emerging markets, while India saw the US as a partner capable of supporting its rise in technology, defense, and global influence. Landmark agreements, such as the Civil Nuclear Deal of 2005, were hailed as symbols of a new era of trust. This was the period when the rhetoric of natural allies became a common feature of diplomatic exchanges, suggesting that the partnership was not merely tactical, but destined. However, destiny in international relations is never guaranteed, and the seeds of discontent were already present. The cracks began to emerge in part because each country's expectations were not fully aligned. The United States, while recognizing India's need for independence, nevertheless believed that its growing partnership with New Delhi would gradually mold India into a more reliable ally against adversaries like China. For Washington, shared democratic values implied not just cooperation, but also alignment in global decision-making. India, however, viewed democracy differently, not as a means of falling into lockstep with another power, but as a principle that also justified its right to chart its own course. Thus, what the US saw as natural solidarity, India saw as pressure to conform, and what India described as non-alignment, the US sometimes perceived as hesitation or unreliability. The shared democratic identity, while a source of pride for both nations, also carried different meanings. For the US, democracy was often tied to universalizing ideals, exporting freedom, and promoting human rights abroad. For India, democracy was an achievement hard-won from colonial rule, and therefore tied to sovereignty and non-interference. This subtle but profound difference shaped how the two countries approached issues like human rights, foreign interventions, and global governance. When the US criticized India on internal matters such as religious freedom or civil rights, New Delhi interpreted it as condescension rather than constructive advice. Likewise, when India refused to openly support US positions on conflicts like the war in Ukraine, Washington saw it as undermining the democratic front it wanted to project globally. Economic cooperation, too, reflected both unity and divergence. On one hand, trade between the two nations grew significantly, and the US became one of India's largest trading partners. On the other hand, disputes over tariffs, intellectual property, and market access revealed structural differences in their economic philosophies. The US, promoting free market ideals, expected India to liberalize further and allow greater access to American businesses. India, however, with its domestic political pressures and emphasis on protecting its industries, was unwilling to expose its economy too freely. These economic cracks, while not large enough to collapse the partnership, symbolized the friction between ambition and reality. Another important factor that deepened the cracks was the geopolitical context. For the US, China emerged as the central strategic competitor, and its entire foreign policy, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, revolved around containing Beijing's rise. In this calculation, India was expected to be a frontline partner, a counterweight to China both militarily and economically. India, while wary of China and keen to defend its sovereignty, was not willing to be subsumed into an American strategy that treated it as a pawn in a larger game. India's refusal to join formal military alliances and its insistence on keeping channels open with Russia and other powers reinforced this sense of divergence. Shared root of strategic interest in stability clashed with differing approaches on how to achieve it, creating further cracks. Domestic politics on both sides also played a role in amplifying mistrust. In the US, administrations changed frequently, and with each came new priorities. India often saw American foreign policy as inconsistent, swinging between cooperation and coercion depending on the party in power. In India, leaders across the political spectrum were cautious of getting too close to the US, fearing it might compromise India's image as an independent power. This lack of long-term consistency meant that progress in the relationship was always vulnerable to sudden reversals. The shared roots of democracy and strategic interest therefore provided a strong foundation for US-India relations, but the cracks that emerged reflected how those same roots were interpreted differently in practice. The partnership was built on ideals, but it stumbled on expectations. It was nurtured by mutual admiration, but tested by mistrust. The cracks were not signs of hostility, but indicators of how difficult it is to sustain a partnership between two nations that both aspire to lead rather than follow. In the end, these emerging cracks reveal a truth about international relations. Even the strongest of shared values cannot automatically overcome differences in interest, identity, and perception. The US and India are bound by history and common principles, yet their journey together is continually challenged by the question of how to reconcile independence with interdependence, autonomy with alliance, and pride with partnership. When examining the strains in the US-India relationship, many analysts point to the role of the United States as a significant contributor to the rift. The United States, as the more established global superpower, often approached the partnership with expectations that reflected its own worldview and assumptions about leadership. From Washington's perspective, the relationship with India was not only about trade and cultural ties, but also about strategic alignment, particularly in countering China and promoting liberal democratic values worldwide. Yet in this approach lay some of the very missteps that alienated New Delhi and nurtured skepticism within India's political and strategic circles. The American tendency to treat India as a partner in name but as a subordinate in practice created the impression that the US was less interested in an equal relationship and more invested in shaping India into a mirror of its own policies and priorities. One of the primary ways the US contributed to the strains was through the inconsistency of its foreign policy. Successive American administrations often shifted their stance toward India depending on their immediate strategic goals. Under one president, India was celebrated as a pillar of democracy and a crucial ally against China. Under another, it was criticized on issues of trade, tariffs, or internal governance. These abrupt swings left Indian policymakers frustrated, for they suggested that America's friendship was transactional rather than principled. India sought a steady and predictable partner, but what it often encountered was an ally whose warmth fluctuated with the political winds in Washington. The withdrawal of Generalized System of Preferences (GSP) trade benefits by the US in 2019, after years of promising closer economic ties, is one example of how abrupt policy decisions undermine trust. Another issue was the perception of double standards. The United States has long presented itself as a global champion of democracy and human rights, but in practice it has often partnered with authoritarian regimes when it suited its strategic interests. This contradiction was not lost on India, which resented being singled out for criticism on domestic issues while watching the US overlook the records of its other allies. When American officials and think tanks criticized India for its internal policies, whether related to religious freedom, Kashmir, or media rights, Indian leaders interpreted this as hypocrisy and interference. The US claimed it was holding India accountable as a fellow democracy, but from India's perspective, this selective scrutiny suggested that the US was unwilling to accept India on its own terms. The effect was to create resentment and suspicion that the partnership came with strings attached. Equally important was the American expectation that India would naturally align itself with Washington's global strategy. For decades, US policymakers viewed India primarily through the prism of their rivalry with China. India was cast as a counterweight to Beijing, and its strategic autonomy was often seen as a liability rather than an asset. American diplomats frequently pressed India to take clearer positions against China, whether in the South China Sea, at the United Nations, or within groupings like the Quad. However, India's reluctance to fully embrace this role reflected its own priorities, managing its border disputes with China without triggering open confrontation and maintaining economic ties where necessary. By consistently framing India's role in terms of US-China competition, Washington failed to recognize that New Delhi's strategic calculus was not identical to its own. This lack of empathy for India's independent worldview created friction and a perception in India that the US was less interested in partnership than in recruitment. Defense cooperation, while expanded significantly over the past 2 decades, also illustrated the imbalance. The US pushed India to purchase American defense technology and equipment, yet often placed restrictions on technology transfer or imposed sanctions when India pursued ties with Russia. This left India in a bind, for it needed to modernize its military but did not want to rely solely on one supplier. The US approach seemed less like genuine partnership and more like an attempt to reorient India's defense dependence away from Moscow toward Washington. While strategically logical from the American side, it ignored the realities of India's long-standing defense ties with Russia and the need for a diversified supply base. The pressure to choose sides irritated New Delhi and reinforced the impression that the US was trying to dictate rather than cooperate. Economic disputes added another layer to the responsibility the US bears in the rift. The US repeatedly accused India of protectionism, pointing to its tariffs on agricultural products, e-commerce restrictions, and preference for local manufacturing under programs like Make in India. While some of these accusations had merit, Washington often failed to recognize that India's policies stemmed from domestic economic priorities, such as creating jobs for its massive workforce and protecting small farmers. Instead of working through compromises, the US sometimes responded with threats of punitive tariffs or trade wars. These tactics reinforced the perception that the US was treating India not as a partner to be understood, but as a problem to be fixed. Economic coercion, even if subtle, undermined the goodwill that had been built through years of cooperation. Another contributing factor was the cultural and diplomatic tone adopted by the US. American officials often used language that, even if unintended, came across as patronizing to Indian counterparts. The tendency to lecture India about democracy or to suggest that it needed guidance to reach its potential grated against India's self-image as a proud and rising power. India did not want to be seen as a student learning from a teacher, but as a peer engaged in mutual learning. The failure to adjust diplomatic tone to reflect this sensitivity was a miscalculation that sowed irritation over time. Furthermore, the US sometimes underestimated the importance of history in shaping India's behavior. India's non-aligned movement during the Cold War was not simply a matter of ideology, but a reflection of deep-seated distrust of great power dominance. Having endured colonization, India was acutely sensitive to external pressure and wary of being drawn into another power bloc. Yet American policymakers frequently dismissed this as outdated thinking, failing to see how it still influenced Indian strategic culture. By neglecting to respect India's need for autonomy, the US created conditions where India felt compelled to resist rather than embrace alignment. It is also worth noting the broader American approach to alliances, which often revolves around the expectation of loyalty. The US has long been accustomed to working with treaty allies like NATO members or Japan, where commitments are formal and binding. India, by contrast, has always resisted such binding alliances. When Washington expected India to act like a traditional ally, it overlooked the fact that India would never abandon its strategic independence. The repeated disappointment when India charted its own course, whether abstaining from UN votes on Russia or refusing to isolate Iran, reflected the gap between American expectations and Indian realities. All of these factors highlight how the United States, through its policies, attitudes, and assumptions, bears a significant share of responsibility for the current strains in the partnership. While not solely to blame, the US often miscalculated India's priorities, underestimated its desire for equality, and overestimated the ease with which it would align with American objectives. In doing so, it unintentionally alienated the very partner it sought to cultivate. By failing to fully respect India's autonomy and by allowing inconsistency, double standards, and pressure tactics to define the relationship at key moments, the US contributed to the erosion of trust that many today describe as a breakup or at least a cooling of ties. When considering India's role in the strains of its relationship with the United States, one must acknowledge that New Delhi too bears a significant share of responsibility. The partnership was never intended to be one-sided. And just as Washington's assumptions and actions contributed to the cracks, India's choices, hesitations, and steadfast insistence on strategic autonomy created obstacles that made the alliance less effective than it could have been. India, proud of its independence and wary of great power dominance, often responded to American overtures with caution, sometimes bordering on suspicion. This posture, while understandable given India's historical experiences, also limited the depth of trust and cooperation that the US expected from a partner of its stature. By maintaining ties that often conflicted with American expectations, by refusing to fully align on global issues, and by resisting integration into US-led economic and defense frameworks, India contributed to the growing sense of estrangement that some now describe as a breakup. A key dimension of India's responsibility lies in its unwavering commitment to strategic autonomy. Since independence, India has defined its foreign policy around the principle that it will not become subordinate to any external power. This philosophy was codified during the Cold War through the Non-Aligned Movement, which sought to keep India equidistant from both the American and Soviet blocs. Even after the Cold War ended, this instinct for autonomy did not disappear. It remained central to India's identity, shaping its decisions across decades. While autonomy preserved India's sovereignty and freedom of action, it also created friction with the US, which often expected closer alignment. By refusing to give Washington the kind of unequivocal loyalty it has enjoyed from treaty allies, India frustrated American policymakers who believed the partnership demanded more concrete commitments. India, by choosing to guard its independence so fiercely, inevitably created conditions where mistrust grew. One example of this divergence can be seen in India's continued closeness with Russia. For India, Moscow has been a reliable defense partner for decades, supplying a majority of its military hardware and providing critical support during conflicts when Western nations were reluctant. India views this relationship as indispensable for its national security. However, to the US, India's willingness to distance itself from Russia, especially after the Ukraine conflict, seemed like a betrayal of democratic solidarity. India's decision to abstain from UN resolutions condemning Russia and its continued purchase of discounted Russian oil after Western sanctions deepened the perception in Washington that India was unwilling to stand firmly with the US on matters of principle. While India justified these decisions as matters of national interest and energy security, the effect was to cast doubt on its reliability as a partner. India's handling of trade and economic relations with the US also added to the friction. While the US pressed for liberalization and greater market access, India often pursued protectionist policies. Programs like Make in India were designed to boost domestic manufacturing and reduce reliance on imports, but they also created barriers for American companies seeking to enter or expand in the Indian market. Disputes over tariffs on agricultural goods, medical equipment, and technology products became recurrent points of contention. By insisting on protecting its domestic industries at the expense of greater openness, India reinforced the American perception that it was unwilling to engage in fair and reciprocal trade. This insistence on economic nationalism, while politically popular at home, eroded goodwill and limited the depth of economic cooperation. India's hesitancy to fully embrace military cooperation further underscored its responsibility for the strains. While India signed foundational defense agreements with the US and participated in joint military exercises like the Malabar naval drills, it remained reluctant to move beyond a certain point. Unlike traditional American allies, India refused to enter into binding military alliances or allow foreign bases on its soil. Even within frameworks like the Quad, India emphasized economic and developmental cooperation over overt military coordination. For Washington, this cautious approach was disappointing. The US expected India to take on a more assertive role in balancing China, but New Delhi consistently avoided commitments that could be perceived as joining an American-led bloc. By doing so, India maintained its cherished autonomy, but also weakened the credibility of the US-India defense partnership in Washington's eyes. Another way India contributed to the cooling of relations was through its selective engagement with global issues. On matters where India's national interest was directly at stake, it took bold stances, but on issues where the US expected solidarity, India often remained neutral or ambiguous. For example, on Iran, India sought to preserve its energy imports and ties despite American pressure for sanctions. On climate change, India insisted on its right to pursue development, even if it meant slower adoption of renewable commitments, which sometimes frustrated Washington's climate agenda. These decisions reflected India's priorities, but they also highlighted a pattern of reluctance to harmonize with US initiatives on the global stage. While Washington saw India as hedging, India saw itself as protecting its sovereignty, yet the result was the same: mutual frustration and erosion of trust. Domestic politics in India also played a role in straining ties. Indian leaders, mindful of the sensitivities of their electorate, were often cautious about being seen as too close to the US. In Indian political discourse, dependence on foreign powers has historically been equated with weakness or loss of sovereignty. To avoid this perception, Indian governments, regardless of party, maintained a deliberate distance in rhetoric even when engaging substantively with Washington. This rhetorical restraint, however, often confused American counterparts, who wondered whether India truly valued the partnership or was merely using it as leverage against other powers. By failing to clearly communicate its intentions, India inadvertently deepened American doubts. Another area of tension has been India's management of human rights and democracy-related criticism from the US. Rather than engaging constructively, Indian leaders often reacted defensively, dismissing such concerns as external interference. While sovereignty is a legitimate principle, this defensiveness created the perception that India was unwilling to tolerate any scrutiny, even from a democratic partner. From Washington's perspective, this unwillingness to engage on shared democratic values undermined one of the pillars of the relationship. By refusing to acknowledge areas where reform could strengthen its democracy, India contributed to the perception that it wanted partnership only on its own terms, without compromise. Moreover, India sometimes underestimated the value of consistency in its foreign policy signaling. Its balancing act between the US, Russia, China, and other powers often appeared to Washington as indecisiveness or opportunism. While the strategy of multi-alignment made sense for India's national interest, it complicated American efforts to present a unified democratic front globally. By trying to maintain equidistance among rival powers, India conveyed the impression that it was unwilling to make difficult choices, which in turn cast doubt on the depth of its commitment to the US partnership. In all these ways, India bears responsibility for the current strains in its relationship with the US. Its insistence on autonomy, its reluctance to break away from Russia, its protectionist economic policies, its hesitancy in military cooperation, and its selective approach to global issues all contributed to the perception that it was not willing to fully embrace the partnership. While these choices may have been rational from India's perspective, they created friction that weakened trust and limited progress. The result is a relationship that, while still important, is often described as troubled or stagnant. By prioritizing autonomy above alignment and by resisting the compromises that deeper partnerships demand, India has played a central role in creating the cracks that threaten what was once heralded as a defining partnership of the 21st century. Economic ties between the United States and India have long been described as one of the strongest pillars of their relationship. And indeed, trade and investment flows between the two nations have grown significantly over the years. However, the sphere of cooperation, rather than being a purely positive story, has also become one of the major sources of friction. Disputes over tariffs, market access, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, and investment restrictions have repeatedly soured the atmosphere of collaboration. While both countries recognize the immense potential of their economic partnership, their inability to bridge differences in economic philosophy and policy has weakened trust. These recurring clashes are not only about numbers on trade balances or taxes on specific goods, but also about deeper questions of sovereignty, fairness, and the role of government in guiding national economy. They represent yet another way in which the dream of a seamless US-India partnership has faltered under the weight of practical reality. From the American perspective, India has often been accused of practicing protectionism under the guise of promoting self-reliance. Washington has long demanded greater market access for American goods and services, ranging from agricultural products to medical devices. But India has consistently maintained higher tariffs and regulatory barriers than the US found acceptable. For instance, disputes have emerged over India's tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, on dairy products that did not conform to Indian religious standards, and on technology imports where India insisted on stricter controls. The US saw these as unnecessary obstacles that deprived its companies of fair competition. On the other side, India viewed these tariffs as legitimate tools to protect its farmers, small businesses, and growing industries from being overwhelmed by foreign competition. The conflict here was not just about trade figures, but about fundamentally different approaches to economic development, one rooted in liberalization and open markets, the other rooted in safeguarding vulnerable domestic sectors. The withdrawal of India's eligibility under the Generalized System of Preferences (GSP) by the US in 2019 became a flashpoint in the economic relationship. For decades, India had enjoyed preferential access to American markets for many of its exports. When the US withdrew these benefits, citing India's failure to provide reciprocal access to American products, New Delhi saw it as an unfair and politically motivated move. While the actual economic impact of the withdrawal was relatively small in dollar terms, its symbolic effect was significant. It reminded India that the US could use economic tools coercively, and it reinforced suspicions that Washington viewed the partnership as conditional. Instead of bringing the two nations closer, the dispute deepened mistrust and made future trade negotiations even more contentious. Technology and intellectual property disputes have also played a significant role in creating economic friction. The US, home to many of the world's largest technology companies, has frequently criticized India for failing to adequately protect intellectual property rights. American pharmaceutical companies, for instance, have objected to India's policies on generic medicines, arguing that they undermine innovation and profitability. India, on the other hand, has defended its policies as necessary to ensure affordable health care for its population. Similarly, disputes over data localization, India's insistence that data generated within its borders must be stored domestically, have drawn sharp criticism from American firms that prefer the flexibility of global data flows. These disagreements reflect not only commercial tensions, but also deeper differences in how each country balances public interest, corporate profit, and national security. The rise of India's self-reliance agenda under the slogan Atmanirbhar Bharat added another layer of tension. While India promoted the initiative as a way to boost domestic manufacturing, reduce dependency on imports, and strengthen national security, Washington interpreted it as a protectionist program that would limit opportunities for foreign companies. The tension became evident in areas like defense procurement, where India increasingly insisted on local production, and in e-commerce, where American giants like Amazon and Walmart-owned Flipkart faced stringent regulations that favored local competitors. These measures were politically popular in India, but they angered Washington and reinforced the perception that India was not truly committed to a free and open economic partnership. Agriculture has been another contentious sector. The U.S. has repeatedly pushed for greater access for its agricultural exports, particularly dairy and poultry. But India has resisted on cultural and religious grounds, as well as concerns for small farmers' livelihoods. Indian negotiators have argued that American agricultural subsidies create unfair competition, while the U.S. has accused India of hiding protectionism behind cultural justifications. These disputes have become symbolic of the broader economic differences. India insists that it must protect vulnerable sectors to maintain social stability, while the U.S. demands a level playing field for its producers. Neither side is willing to compromise easily, and the result is a cycle of accusations and counter-accusations that damage the larger relationship. Another key point of contention is the digital economy. With India emerging as one of the largest markets for technology and digital services, American firms have invested heavily in expanding their footprint. Yet India has imposed stricter rules on foreign digital platforms, including requirements for content moderation, data storage, and restrictions on competition practices. The U.S. views these as discriminatory policies that disadvantage its companies, while India justifies them as necessary for sovereignty, cultural preservation, and consumer protection. The clash over the digital economy has become particularly significant because it touches upon issues of both economics and national security. Washington sees India as restricting the very companies that could drive innovation and connectivity, while New Delhi fears foreign domination of its digital landscape. Energy trade has similarly reflected both cooperation and divergence. The U.S. has become a significant supplier of crude oil and liquefied natural gas to India, creating new avenues for trade. However, when Washington pressured India to cut imports of Iranian oil as part of its sanctions regime, New Delhi resisted, arguing that its energy security could not be dictated by external powers. Although India eventually complied under threat of sanctions, the episode underscored how economic issues were deeply intertwined with sovereignty concerns. For India, reliance on American energy came with the risk of vulnerability to U.S. political decisions, while for Washington, India's hesitation to follow sanctions policy reflected unreliability as a partner. The economic friction between the two countries also reflects their divergent domestic priorities. The U.S., with its highly developed economy, emphasizes rules that facilitate globalization and open markets. India, still battling poverty, unemployment, and inequality, places emphasis on policies that protect its citizens and industries. What Washington sees as obstructionism, New Delhi sees as pragmatism. The problem is not that either side is entirely wrong, but that their perspectives often clash in ways that are difficult to reconcile. As a result, every trade negotiation tends to become drawn out, contentious, and vulnerable to collapse over seemingly small issues. In the broader sense, these economic disputes have weakened the trust necessary for a robust strategic partnership. For Washington, India's reluctance to liberalize is evidence that it is not ready to be a fully reliable partner in shaping global economic rules. For New Delhi, America's use of punitive trade measures and its pressure to open markets feels like coercion rather than cooperation. The result is a partnership that has grown in size but not in depth, a relationship where economic ties are celebrated in public statements but marred by disputes behind closed doors. Ultimately, the persistent economic friction between the U.S. and India represents more than just disagreements over tariffs or market rules. It symbolizes the deeper challenges of reconciling two very different visions of development and fairness. The U.S. expects India to gradually converge toward a liberal, open market model that complements American corporate interests, while India insists on pursuing a developmental model that safeguards its sovereignty and prioritizes the welfare of its vast population. These differences are not insurmountable, but they require patience, compromise, and mutual respect. The failure to bridge these divides has meant that instead of serving as a stabilizing pillar, economics has often become another arena where mistrust accumulates, feeding into the broader narrative of a strained partnership. One of the most profound sources of strain between the United States and India lies not in trade figures or defense deals, but in the way the two nations perceive themselves and each other. At the heart of the cooling relationship is a clash of worldviews, shaped by history, identity, and ambition. The U.S. approaches international relations from the standpoint of a global leader accustomed to setting rules and expecting others to follow, while India views itself as an ancient civilization and a rising power determined to safeguard its autonomy and resist external dominance. This difference in self-perception and expectation creates a constant undercurrent of tension that seeps into every aspect of the relationship. Shared democratic values, while often touted as the foundation of their partnership, are interpreted in vastly different ways, and rather than serving as a unifying force, they sometimes highlight the distance between them. The American worldview is rooted in its long-standing role as the world's most powerful democracy and the architect of much of the post-World War II international order. Washington sees alliances and partnerships not just as cooperative arrangements, but as instruments for advancing a broader global mission, promoting liberal democracy, countering authoritarianism, and preserving U.S.-led structures of trade and security. In this framework, India's value lies not only in its market size or geographic location, but in its symbolic status as the world's largest democracy. American leaders often expect India to act as a natural partner in defending democratic ideals on the global stage, from supporting interventions in troubled regions to condemning authoritarian aggressors. Yet India's worldview is shaped by different experiences. Having endured colonialism, partition, and decades of economic struggle, India interprets democracy less as a global project and more as a domestic achievement, something to be nurtured internally while maintaining independence abroad. When the U.S. expects India to mirror its activism in promoting democracy overseas, India resists seeing such demands as incompatible with its own priorities. This divergence became especially clear in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. The U.S. and its European allies wanted to portray the struggle as one of democracy versus authoritarianism, and expected India as a democratic nation to join in isolating Russia. Yet India abstained in United Nations votes, continued to buy Russian oil, and refused to issue harsh condemnations. From Washington's perspective, this was a failure to live up to democratic solidarity. From New Delhi's perspective, it was simply an assertion of national interest and a demonstration that democracy at home did not require alignment with Western agendas abroad. This episode highlighted how the same word democracy carries different meanings for the two nations, one universalist and missionary, the other sovereign and defensive. The clash of worldviews also extends to the way each country perceives power and hierarchy. The United States, as the established global leader, is used to partners accepting its leadership role. NATO allies, for instance, align their policies with Washington's guidance, even when they disagree on details. India, however, rejects any notion of hierarchy in partnerships. It insists on equality, often reminding American counterparts that cooperation must be based on respect for sovereignty and non-interference. This insistence sometimes frustrates Washington, where policymakers expect a certain degree of alignment in exchange for access to advanced technology, intelligence sharing, and defense cooperation. For India, though, even the perception of being treated as a junior partner is unacceptable. The resulting tension is not about tangible benefits, but about dignity and recognition, concepts deeply ingrained in India's civilizational identity. Another area where worldviews diverge is in the approach to multilateralism. The United States tends to view international institutions as extensions of its own influence, tools through which it can shape global norms and enforce rules. India, on the other hand, often sees these institutions as biased or outdated, designed in an era when its voice was marginalized. India's push for reforms in the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and other global bodies reflects its desire to reshape the international order to better reflect the realities of the 21st. While the US supports India rhetorically, it is less enthusiastic about reforms that might dilute its own dominance. This half-hearted support feeds into India's suspicion that the US wants partnership only when it serves American interests, not when it comes to genuinely sharing power. The economic worldview further illustrates these differences. The US, with its faith in open markets and globalization, believes that economic liberalization leads to prosperity and stability. India, however, shaped by decades of poverty and inequality, remains cautious. It sees economic policy as a tool for protecting the vulnerable and reducing dependency, not simply for maximizing global efficiency. This explains its cautious approach to trade deals, its insistence on protecting small farmers, and its push for digital sovereignty. While the US views these measures as obstacles to free trade, India views them as essential for maintaining social stability. Here again, the clash is not about the end goal. Both want prosperity, but about the path to achieving it. Defense cooperation also exposes the clash of perspectives. For Washington, military partnerships often involve integration, interoperability, and alignment of strategic objectives. For India, defense cooperation must never compromise autonomy. Even as it signs agreements with the US and participates in joint exercises, India avoids any arrangement that could resemble an alliance. It refuses to allow American bases on its soil or to enter binding mutual defense commitments. From the US viewpoint, this makes India an unreliable partner in security terms. From India's viewpoint, such caution is essential to avoid entanglement and conflicts that do not serve its interests. Thus, while the US pushes for deeper integration, India maintains a careful distance, leading to frustration on both sides. Cultural differences also shape the clash of worldviews. American political discourse often includes open criticism of partners when they fall short of democratic ideals, human rights standards, or liberal values. India, however, interprets such criticism as disrespect and interference. When US officials comment on issues such as religious freedom or civil liberties in India, they believe they are upholding universal principles. India, however, sees such comments as dismissive of its sovereignty and insensitive to its unique context. This clash in approach, universalist versus contextualist, further erodes trust. The perception gap is worsened by the way each side views global power shifts. The US sees itself as the central actor in countering the rise of China and expects India to play a frontline role in this strategy. India, however, views China primarily as a regional rival and border adversary, not necessarily as part of a global ideological battle. It wants to manage its China problem pragmatically without being dragged into a broader US-China rivalry. The US interprets this caution as hesitation, while India sees it as prudence. Once again, the clash of worldviews produces disappointment rather than cooperation. This fundamental difference in how the US and India perceive democracy, sovereignty, power, and responsibility ensures that tensions will persist unless both sides learn to respect and adapt to each other's perspectives. The US must recognize that India will never be a subordinate ally, while India must accept that true partnership requires a certain degree of alignment and compromise. Until this gap is bridged, every disagreement, whether over trade, defense, or diplomacy, will be amplified by the deeper clash of worldviews that underpins the relationship. When trying to determine who bears responsibility for the weakening of ties between the United States and India, it is tempting to place blame squarely on one side. It is easy to say that Washington, with its shifting foreign policy goals and tendency to lecture, alienated New Delhi. Equally, one could argue that India, with its stubborn insistence on strategic autonomy and its reluctance to fully commit, has failed to meet the expectations of a true partner. Yet the reality is more complex. The strain in US-India relations is not the result of one nation's fault alone, but a shared outcome of mismatched priorities, miscommunication, and mutual misjudgments. Both countries at different times have contributed to building walls where bridges could have been constructed. Acknowledging this shared responsibility is not an exercise in blame, it is a necessary step toward understanding how the relationship can be salvaged and reimagined. From the American side, much of the problem lies in inconsistency. U.S. foreign policy has often oscillated depending on administrations, with Democrats and Republicans approaching India from different angles. At times, India is courted as a vital democratic partner in Asia, a counterweight to China, and a market for U.S. technology and defense exports. At other times, it is criticized for its human rights record, its protectionist policies, or its unwillingness to align closely with American-led initiatives. This lack of a steady, coherent, long-term strategy creates confusion and mistrust in New Delhi. India never knows whether the promises made by one administration will be honored by the next. For a country that prizes predictability and autonomy in international affairs, this inconsistency makes the U.S. appear unreliable. Another American contribution to the strain is the subtle but persistent perception of hierarchy. While American policymakers often speak of partnership, their actions sometimes suggest they still see India as a junior player in a system designed by the West. This can be seen in Washington's hesitation to support India's bid for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, or its half-hearted backing of reforms in international institutions where the U.S. has entrenched influence. To India, this is a signal that the U.S. wants cooperation without real equality. The imbalance of expectations, where the U.S. seeks loyalty in exchange for limited recognition, fuels resentment in New Delhi. From India's side, the contribution to the rift is rooted in its determination to never be tied down. India's historical experience with colonialism has made independence and sovereignty deeply sacred. As a result, India insists on charting its own course, even when working with partners. This explains why India resists binding defense alliances, avoids taking sides in conflicts, and maintains relationships with rivals of the U.S., such as Russia and Iran. While this approach secures India's autonomy, it frustrates American policymakers who expect a greater degree of alignment in return for sharing advanced technology, intelligence, and diplomatic support. To Washington, India sometimes appears as a partner that takes more than it gives, benefiting from American goodwill without fully committing to the responsibilities of a strategic partnership. Economics also reflects India's share of responsibility for the tensions. While India desires investment and access to American markets, it often hesitates to open its own economy in ways the U.S. demands. Tariffs, digital sovereignty laws, and protective policies for domestic industries all send a message that India values self-reliance above seamless integration. While this is consistent with its domestic priorities, it clashes with the American worldview, which expects open markets and reciprocal trade. Instead of working toward creative compromises, India often defaults to resistance, which deepens American frustration. Cultural and political differences compound the problem. Indian leaders are highly sensitive to external criticism, especially on domestic matters such as religious freedom, minority rights, and democratic backsliding. When U.S. officials or lawmakers raise concerns about these issues, they may see it as upholding universal principles, but India sees it as interference. In turn, Indian leaders push back sharply, sometimes escalating disputes rather than diffusing them. This cycle of accusation and rebuttal erodes trust further, even when cooperation in other areas continues. Both nations also share responsibility in their misreading of each other's long-term intentions. The U.S. often assumes that India's rise will naturally align with American interests, that India will become a steadfast democratic ally, much like Japan or Australia. India, on the other hand, assumes that the U.S. will eventually recognize its civilizational greatness and treat it as an equal in shaping the global order. Neither side's expectation fully matches reality. India will not surrender its autonomy for alignment, and the U.S. will not dilute its dominance to accommodate India's vision of multipolarity. These misjudgments create repeated cycles of hope and disappointment, leading to frustration on both sides. It is also true that the global context magnifies the cracks in the relationship. The rise of China, the war in Ukraine, and the reshaping of supply chains all demand clarity and alignment from partners. In such a tense international environment, the lack of complete alignment between the U.S. and India becomes more visible. What might have been manageable differences in a more stable world now appear as fundamental contradictions. The US, under pressure to rally allies against authoritarian powers, expects India to act decisively. India, wary of being entangled in foreign conflicts, resists. Both sides therefore appear to let each other down, though both are acting in line with their own rational self-interest. The shared responsibility lies not in the fact that each side pursues its interests, but in the failure to build mechanisms to manage those differences constructively. Instead of recognizing the divergence early and working on flexible frameworks of cooperation, both the US and India allowed frustrations to build. The US accused India of unreliability, while India accused the US of arrogance. This blame game overshadowed opportunities for compromise. Even on areas where interests overlap, such as climate change, counterterrorism, digital technology, and healthcare, progress has been slower than it could have been, because mistrust seeps into every negotiation. Yet the shared responsibility also implies shared opportunity. If the relationship has faltered because of actions and inactions on both sides, it can also be repaired by conscious effort from both. The US must learn to accept India on its own terms, recognizing that India's value lies not in being a loyal ally, but in being an independent pole in a multipolar world. India, in turn, must acknowledge that partnerships require reciprocity and that it cannot expect American support without showing flexibility and alignment where interests converge. Both nations must cultivate patience, recognizing that theirs is not a transactional relationship but a strategic one shaped by long timelines. Ultimately, the responsibility for the so-called breakup lies not in betrayal but in the inability of both nations to fully reconcile their worldviews and priorities. They are partners bound by democracy but divided by interpretation, united by interests but separated by expectations. By accepting that both sides share responsibility, the blame game can give way to a more pragmatic dialogue. Rather than asking who is at fault, the more productive question is what each side is willing to do differently to ensure that the relationship does not collapse under the weight of disappointment. Shared responsibility, if acknowledged honestly, can become the foundation for shared renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, when we step back and look at the full picture, it becomes clear that the story of the United States and India is not one of betrayal but of unmet expectations, misread intentions, and unspoken assumptions. Both nations, with their proud histories and democratic values, walked into this partnership with great hope, but also with very different lenses. America sought a loyal ally to reinforce its vision of global order, while India sought recognition as an equal power charting its own path. Along the way, both fell into the trap of believing the other would eventually bend, instead of embracing the reality that the strength of this partnership lay in its differences as much as its similarities. The so-called breakup is therefore not the end of a relationship, but a reminder of its unfinished work. To blame one side alone would be to ignore the complexity of international partnerships. The truth is that both the United States and India must shoulder responsibility for where things stand today. And yet that same shared responsibility gives them the power to change the future. If Washington can learn the art of patience and respect, and if New Delhi can learn the power of reciprocity and trust, then this relationship can still rise above its current cracks and grow into the true partnership the world desperately needs. For in a century defined by great uncertainty, by the rise of China, by the turbulence of technology, by the urgency of climate change, neither India nor the United States can afford estrangement. Their destinies are too intertwined, their peoples too connected, their values too overlapping. The real test is not whether they stumble, but whether they have the vision and courage to stand up together after the stumble. So let us not close this chapter with blame, but with resolve. Resolve that both nations, despite differences, will choose dialogue over distance, partnership over pride, and shared purpose over suspicion. For if the United States and India can rise above their misunderstandings, they will not only heal their own partnership, they will shape a better, freer, and more balanced world for generations to come.